Hello everyone, this is once again your old history professor, and here we are going to do another lecture for History 231, Ancient Mediterranean World, and today's lecture is going to be number 19, and that is Rome and the Rise of Sasanid Persia, which is a very interesting story. So let us go ahead and get started here. And we left off last time, we were talking about life in the Roman Empire, the society of the Roman Empire, and there are a lot of different features of this that we can talk about, and I just want to touch on a few of these. And I'd like to start out today by touching on one of the less savory aspects of life in the Roman Empire, and that is the existence of slavery. Rome was a heavily slave-oriented society. Much like ancient Greece, Rome was a heavily slave-oriented society, and part of the reason was that when you conquered people, prisoners of war in the ancient world were frequently made into slaves. They would be turned into a cheap source of labor and things like this. And we've actually seen how the Roman Republic was undermined by this fact, that when you have so many slaves, you undermine things by having poor people, free people, can't get jobs because slaves are doing all the jobs. So literally they're losing all sorts of job opportunities, which cause social unrest and instability, and ultimately the Roman Republic would collapse. Now, slavery is not the only reason it collapsed, but it's one of the reasons things got out of hand and it fell apart. So this is something to keep in mind. But slavery is not just an economic institution, it's a social institution. And that's an interesting feature of it. Societies that have and keep slaves often do so for social reasons, even more than economic ones. So let's take a look at the Roman example of this here. Keep in mind a couple of very interesting things here. The United States here has a history of slavery itself. Our country fought a civil war over slavery because the biggest disaster this country has ever faced was the Civil War, and it was basically fought over slavery. Maybe not entirely, but almost entirely over slavery. Slavery was a big thing. But here's the thing, all right? The Roman world has slavery too, and it has mass slavery, just as the United States did prior to the Civil War. But the Roman system of slavery is different from the American system of slavery in some very important ways. They still both have slaves, but they do it in slightly different ways, for slightly different reasons. And that's something to keep in mind here. And the first thing to keep in mind is this. The American system of slavery was challenged from a very early time by people who said this is immoral. Groups like the Quakers, for example, who said this is not a good thing to do. You don't do this to other people. Enslaving people is bad. And so they would do things like run the Underground Railroad and things like that. And so slavery in the United States was a controversial issue fairly early on, and long before it was actually done away with after the Civil War. Slavery was a real social division here, and it was a social thing. In the Roman world, that didn't happen. There was no real moral objection to slavery. The Romans really didn't have a problem with keeping slaves and having slaves and even mistreating slaves sometimes. They didn't see it as a problem. It was just the way it was. It was a normal, natural thing. And you'll remember the Greeks, of course, being the snobs that they could be, actually thought slavery was a natural thing as well, because they said, hey, some people are simply better than others. And of course, it's always better when you're the one of the better people and you get to be on top, and that's how the slavery was seen in ancient Greece here. Even Aristotle, brilliant as he was, talks like this. So this is something we see. And the Romans, same problem. They did not see any problems with slavery. It was totally okay with them to have slavery. It was totally natural to them to have slavery. And this reflected all aspects of Roman society. All aspects of Roman society. And this is really kind of interesting, because this means that Christianity, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture, but when Christianity starts growing up and appearing in the Roman world, it is a Roman cultural institution in many ways, including slavery. And one of the great ironies is, as wonderful as Christianity is and all the amazing things that it does, the New Testament, and the Old Testament too, but the New Testament actually says it's okay to have slaves. Let me give you a quote here. All right, this is from the book of Ephesians, our friend Paul in his book of Ephesians, and here's what he says about slavery. I'm going to read this to you here. This is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9 here. All right. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor in their eyes and when their eyes is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not men. because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them. Do not, since you know that he is who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him." End quote. So this is the New Testament. This is in the Bible. And what does it say? It says slavery is okay. Slavery is not a problem. All right? And that is a really, really tricky thing for us today. It's a really tricky thing for us today because in our society, we have a long, dark history in America of slavery because we fought a civil war over slavery, right? Lots of people died over slavery, and we didn't solve it even with a civil war. Then we had 100 years, and then we had to have a civil rights movement, and we still haven't solved the legacy of slavery and racism in America. All right? So this is something when we look at the Romans, we have to keep in mind our own history as well, and this is an interesting kind of thing here. Now, the question we want to ask ourselves, both for ourselves in America and also for the Romans, is this: why? Why keep slaves? This is always an interesting question. Historians and economists and people like this have looked at the question. They said, why do you do this? Why do you have slaves in the first place? Well, one of the things about slavery that we have to keep in mind is it doesn't make a lot of economic sense. Slavery is not economically a very good idea because it's expensive. It costs a lot of money. You have to have a high level of organization. You have to have guards. You have to have soldiers. You have to have all these people to protect you from your slaves because, human beings don't like being enslaved. It's one of those things about us. We just don't like it. And as a result, slaves are always ready to rise up in rebellion against their masters. And they sometimes do, and this can get violent and messy, and a lot of people die. So slavery is not a very good idea. Economically, it's expensive. It's much more expensive than simply having people who are free working for, wages. It costs you a lot less to have free people working than it has slaves. So why are you going to do this? And the best guess we can say for the Romans is this, all right? The reason they had this system, this idea of slavery, because they got some kind of a sick, cheap thrill out of it. The idea that you have absolute power over another human being, some people get off on that. Some people find that really cool. I find it kind of sick myself. I think it's pretty twisted. But the Romans, apparently, many of them thought, hey, I have absolute power over another human being. I must be cool. I must be a great guy. Well, I would say you're not, but this is what they apparently felt here. Now, this caused them a lot of problems. Over the years, this caused them a lot of problems because, again, when you get people, millions of people, and you enslave them, you always run the risk of slave revolts. All right? And this is something that the antebellum South in the United States lived in a constant state of fear of. John Brown made people scared because if he sets off all those millions of African American slaves in the United States, you could have a real problem on your hand, and that's why they stomped him down as fast as they could. All right? Same problem in Rome. We find slave rebellions would show up in Rome, and some of these slaves knew how to fight because they had been trained to be gladiators. The famous example, of course, is our friend Spartacus, right? Good old Spartacus was a gladiator. He'd been trained to fight, so he had his fellow gladiators. They knew how to fight, and so when they rebelled, they could kill a lot of people, and they did. They made a heck of a mess. And the Romans had to put this down with the troops. It was a messy, violent situation, and it was totally avoidable if the Romans had simply not done slavery, but they did. And so Spartacus, of course, caused a huge number of problems. He's not the only one. Slave rebellions were not uncommon in the Roman world. So this was a problem. But of course, they never gave it up. Oh, no, no, no. They get this cheap thrill out of the deal. Now, slavery was not a simple either-or proposition. It was a more complex thing. Some slaves, agricultural slaves, slaves who did brute labor and that sort of thing, were frequently simply worked to death. These would often be prisoners of war, usually young, healthy males, and they'd simply be worked to death, which is pretty awful, absolutely awful. Other slaves, on the other hand, had more value in that they might have a skill. So, for example, Greek slaves were very desired in the Roman world because they might have some smart skill and they could apply that for their masters. And so they could say, for example, tutor your kids. Now, personally, I think that's a really stupid idea because if someone enslaved me and said, I want you tutoring my kids, I'd be teaching their kids a whole lot of bad stuff. I'd be teaching them the wrong things. I'd be messing with them. All right? At least I'd like to think I would be doing that, because let's face it, I wouldn't like being a slave any more than anybody else would like to be a slave. And so if you can mess with people, you'll mess with them. But the thing is this, all right? If you are in a household of that kind, your life as a slave might not be the most pleasant, but it's far from the worst. And you may be living actually physically better than poor free Romans, who of course didn't have a lot. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So Greek slaves in that context might do a little better, all right? Of course, there's also the incredibly ugly side of slavery, and that is sexual slavery. That is to say, if you have young women, it's almost always young women, but not always. There are certainly going to be young men as well who are going to be used in sexual ways with slavery, and that's about as disgusting a thing as I can imagine. That's pretty awful. But this is what the Romans would do. All right? This is the way they could sometimes be. Sometimes, of course, you did free slaves. Freeing of slaves did happen. And of course, when it happened, it's a very interesting institution. Because if you free the slaves, all right, you free the slaves, even those descendants of those slaves could even become full citizens. They could become completely free in this. And this is very, very different from the way that the Greeks would treat freed slaves, all right? And this is a very interesting thing. There was a legal limit, of all things, on the number of slaves you were allowed to free, right? Because if it was up to me, I would have gone and said, well, I'm just going to buy all these slaves and I'm going to free every one of them. But of course, they couldn't do that. They said there's a limited number you can free here, all right? But here's the thing. Because Roman society was built on a model, we're going to talk about this in a few moments, called the patron-client relationship. Freed slaves were often really great clients. You free them and they're grateful to you. They're grateful to you and they become really reliable allies and friends. And that's the upside of this. So if you free your slaves, you've got yourself a built-in group of allies, a built-in group of supporters here, all right? Because after all, just because you free a slave doesn't mean that slave has economic independence, doesn't mean they're suddenly rich, that they can go off on their own. They're still probably going to be dependent on you. So freeing slaves helped you build patron or build clients if you were a wealthy patron. And that's the sort of thing to keep in mind. Some emperors made extensive use of freed slaves. Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, for example, a very sharp guy, made extensive use of freed slaves in his administration because he knew he could trust them and rely on them because they were grateful to him. So that's an interesting sort of thing. Now, the economy of ancient Rome was different from the economy we have today. The United States today is a agricultural economy to a point, but it is much more of an industrialized economy and even a post-industrialized economy. And that's a very different thing from the Roman world. In the Roman world, it was an agricultural economy almost entirely. That was what most people did as a living and most people did to survive. So land was really the essential sign of wealth. And having land, of course, was a big thing. Now, one of the things about farmers, and I think every farmer will agree, is that if you have peace, that is to say you don't have armies marching through your farmland every few days or every few years, it's a lot easier to make a living as a farmer during times of peace. And you can grow more food, you can sell that food, you can make enough money to live, you can do okay. All right? But if there's invasions and fighting and war going on all the time, it doesn't work that way. So farmers in the Roman Empire benefited from what we call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. When the Romans finally imposed peace on the whole Mediterranean world, it brought some economic benefits, especially to people in the countryside, in the farm areas. So this is something that we see here. They benefited from this. All right? And this is an interesting thing. Of course, one of the problems that had happened, that it set off the collapse of the Roman Republic, was the rise of really large, wealthy, landed estates, not small farms. And this is something that we see. And of course, you can use slaves to work the land, and that had caused them all sorts of problems when they had done this. But what this means is you're going to have these large estates, and this is going to set the stage for ultimately the way the medieval world starts to work out based upon large estates and this kind of thing. Cities, well, cities were messy. They were generally supported by local agriculture. So the local agricultural system would keep the cities fed, keep things going in the cities, and so that was a good thing, all right? And cities, of course, were where you found other trades and other activities and things like that here. Most Roman cities were supported by the land around them. The agricultural land around them would feed them. All right, this is fairly normal. The exception to this, the big exception to this, was the city of Rome itself. Rome was dependent, totally dependent, on imported grain. They didn't have enough food to keep Rome running. because they had turned it over to grapes so they could grow grapes, so they could make wine, they could get drunk. Well, that is, of course, great for making money, but it's a real hard way to stay alive. So this is something they did. They would import the grain to Rome, and a lot of it came from Egypt. So Egypt becomes incredibly important to keeping Rome fed. And this means Rome is always living on kind of a knife's edge, right? Because they may not have enough food. If something interrupts the grain deliveries, oh man, you've got yourself a serious problem. You can have urban unrest, you can have rioting, you can have people literally starving in Rome because it's a huge city and it can't grow enough food. It doesn't have enough food to keep itself going. It has to bring it in from outside, especially from Egypt. And this is a really important point. You've got to always figure out how are you going to keep people in cities fed. And this is a big issue today, in the day of the coronavirus and all the issues we're dealing with today. One of the issues they're thinking about is, are we sure we can keep New York City fed? Can we keep Boston fed? Can we keep Hartford fed? Can we keep food in the stores? And our systems of putting food in those stores are not necessarily being totally disrupted by this coronavirus, but they are being impacted. And we're going to have to rethink how we do things. All right. I suspect after this virus has passed, one of the things we're, as a country and as a society, are going to do is have to have a really close look at where we get our food and if that's really the best way to do it. So that will be a very interesting outcome of this whole disastrous coronavirus thing. The Romans, they had the same problem. How do we get our food? We have to import it, and a lot of it came from Egypt because Egypt, remember, is a natural bread basket. But this also leads to potential social unrest, and that can be a serious problem. So this gives you a little bit of information, a little bit of background on life in the Roman Empire, right? What was life like in the Roman Empire? It's a huge subject, but what I'd like to do now is stop this recording and pick up again with some of the political history, and we'll pick up here with the exciting stories of these various emperors. And let's face it, some of them were kind of creepy, but they were always kind of interesting. So we will come back to that in the next section.